They say some people are born under a dark star, but Joanna of Austria was born into its shadow. Her story begins not with a lullaby, but with a death. The moment she entered the world, her mother slipped out of it only 3 days later, leaving the newborn princess to be raised in the cold silence of a convent, shaped more by loss than by love. She was the daughter of emperors, yet loneliness was her first inheritance, and tragedy would follow her like a personal herald. When Joanna was sent to Florence to marry into the powerful Medici family, she was received by the city with triumphal arches, fireworks, and the promise of a glorious future. But her husband, Francesco de' Medici, looked at her once and decided she was unworthy, not for her mind or her spirit, but for the curve of her spine and the limp in her step. From that moment, her life became a gorgeous prison. Behind the glitter of the Florentine court, Joanna lived in a world of whispers about her body, endless pregnancies that broke her bones and her spirit, and a husband whose mistress was given more respect than the Grand Duchess herself. And yet, despite everything, Joanna endured. She gave birth to child after child, burying tiny coffins one after another, until one day, hope finally arrived in the form of a fragile newborn son, the long-awaited heir. But destiny was not finished with her. Because when Joanna, heavily pregnant again, climbed the wide staircase of the Medici palace, something happened that would change the course of European history. A scream echoed through the hall. Servants found her crumpled at the bottom of the steps, gravely injured. By dawn, both she and her unborn child were dead. The court called it an accident. But if it were only an accident, why did so many in the palace whisper that she had not slipped, that someone had merely brushed her shoulder at the top of the stairs? Why did her young son die soon after? Why did Francesco and his mistress die within a single day of each other? And why did every one of these deaths benefit the same people? This is not just the biography of a tragic woman. This is a chain of perfectly timed deaths, a pattern too precise to ignore, a case that was quietly closed centuries ago. Today we open it again, and you will decide whether Joanna of Austria died by misfortune or by design. Joanna of Austria entered the world marked by tragedy long before she could understand the meaning of the word. Born in the cold January of the year 1547 inside the royal chambers of Prague, she arrived after a labor so difficult that it left her mother, Queen Anna, pale and broken. 3 days later, the queen was dead, and the newborn princess lay wrapped in linen, watched over by grieving attendants who whispered prayers rather than lullabies. As the court mourned, no one noticed the subtle signs written into the infant's fragile body, the faint curvature of her spine, the uneven balance of her tiny frame, hints of the scoliosis and pelvic tilt that would shape her posture for the rest of her life. It was as if her body, from the moment of birth, mirrored the imbalance that fate had cast upon her. Her father, Ferdinand of Habsburg, consumed by religious wars and political storms, had no time for a child who reminded him of loss. Joanna was soon placed in the care of nuns in Innsbruck, carried away from the palace in silence, her life defined not by coronation, but by separation. Even as a baby, those who held her sensed something delicate, a vulnerability beyond infancy. Her left shoulder seemed to rest slightly lower than the right, her movements a touch asymmetrical, though no one understood then how deeply this would define her identity, her pain, and her marriage years later. Thus began the life of a girl destined for power, yet shaped by frailty, a future duchess whose body quietly carried the story of her first tragedy. Joanna's childhood unfolded behind monastery walls that knew nothing of royal splendor and everything of discipline, devotion, and silence. After her mother's death, the nuns of Innsbruck became the only constants in her world, raising her with strict tenderness that always stopped short of affection. They taught her to pray before she learned to speak clearly, to stand straight even though her spine, already marked by scoliosis, resisted perfect alignment. The slight downward slope of her left shoulder, the subtle pelvic tilt that made her stance uneven, these became more pronounced as she grew, shaping her posture. It caused the nuns to correct her repeatedly, unaware that her body could never fully obey. She moved through stone corridors with the quiet, deliberate steps of a child who learned early to conceal discomfort. Her days began before dawn, with bells echoing through the cold air, and she knelt for morning prayers on floors that only deepened the ache in her narrow hips. She learned to read sitting on benches that were too hard for her twisted spine, yet she never complained. Instead, she absorbed knowledge with the desperation of someone who understood that learning was her only escape. She copied holy texts with careful strokes, her head tilting slightly from the uneven pull of her muscles, and whenever she faltered, the nuns corrected her without realizing how much the effort cost her. Though surrounded by stern faces and rigid rules, Joanna developed a quiet resilience, a strength born not of defiance, but of endurance. She carried her physical burdens like secrets, never imagining how profoundly they would affect her future, her marriage, and her role in a world that valued appearances above suffering. The monastery taught her silence, but her body taught her something else. Pain could be endured, but it could not be hidden. As Joanna entered adolescence, the Habsburg court reclaimed her from the monastery, determined to polish her into the perfect political bride. Tutors descended upon her life with meticulous precision, reshaping everything from her voice to her posture. They demanded elegance, grace, and flawless composure, yet the body they were working with resisted their expectations. Years of undiagnosed scoliosis had caused her spine to curve, her left shoulder to slope lower than the right, and her pelvis to tilt just enough to make her walk subtly uneven. Each flaw became an obstacle the instructors tried to mold away, though none could fully erase it. She practiced standing for hours, holding books atop her head as her tutors adjusted her stance again and again, urging her to force symmetry into a frame that had none. They corrected her gait until her hips throbbed, unaware that the discomfort they scolded her for was born not of laziness, but of anatomical imbalance. Still, Joanna tried. She trained her chin to lift confidently, her shoulders to square despite the natural drop on one side, her steps to glide as smoothly as expected from a princess destined for a foreign throne. She learned languages, not for pleasure but necessity, mastering Italian long before she knew the man she would marry. She studied diplomacy, etiquette, dance, and music, all while privately wrestling with the pain that followed her through each lesson. Her tutors saw progress. Joan saw the widening gap between the person she was and the flawless image she was expected to become. Every movement reminded her that her body did not belong to the world she was being shaped for. Yet she pushed forward, unaware that these same imperfections would one day provoke disgust in the man who was to be her husband, setting into motion a lifelong tragedy. Joanna's grand entrance into Florence should have marked the beginning of a dazzling new chapter. Yet from the moment her carriage rolled beneath the city's soaring arches in the winter of the year 1565, she understood that the celebration was not meant for her as a woman, only for the political figure she embodied. Florence had been transformed for her arrival. Banners in crimson and gold draped every balcony, musicians played from high windows, and the monumental arches designed by Giorgio Vasari stretched above the crowds like gateways to a promised golden age. People shouted blessings and threw flowers as her procession passed, but she felt all of it fall strangely distant, as if the applause reached only the idea of a duchess, not the flawed, fragile body she lived inside. Hidden beneath layers of brocade, Joanna carried the lifelong imprint of her physical suffering. Her spine, twisted by scoliosis since childhood, curved just enough to pull one shoulder visibly lower than the other, and the chronic pelvic tilt that accompanied it gave her gait a subtle unevenness she had spent years trying to disguise. Countless tutors had drilled posture into her tirelessly, teaching her to tilt her chin and angle her torso in ways that might soften the asymmetry, but no training could fully erase it. When Francesco de' Medici first laid eyes on her, his expression revealed a disappointment so sharp that it pierced straight through the festive noise around them. He noticed at once the imbalance, the delicate irregularity, the imperfection that no embroidery could conceal. In his cold assessment, she read her fate. The city might have welcomed her with fireworks and triumphal arches, but the man she was bound to marry welcomed only disillusion. And as Florence roared with celebration, Joanna felt something entirely different settle over her. A quiet, suffocating certainty that she was not entering a marriage, but stepping into a beautifully decorated prison built for someone who was never meant to be loved. Joanna's first months in Florence taught her a lesson far harsher than anything she had endured in the monastery or the Habsburg court. In this city of art and splendor, she was to be examined, judged, and found wanting. The Medici palaces dazzled her with their marble staircases, vast frescoes, and gold-lit chambers, yet behind every tapestry and every carved doorway lurked the cold eyes of courtiers who measured her value not by her lineage or her intelligence, but by the imperfections she carried in her body. Her slight scoliosis, the curve of her spine that pulled her left shoulder lower than her right, became a silent target for whispers. The subtle pelvic tilt that gave her gait an uneven grace, once merely a quiet discomfort, now seemed magnified in the unforgiving environment of Tuscan refinement. She felt the weight of scrutiny each time she walked through a hall, sensing glances drift toward her as if her very posture betrayed her foreignness. But nowhere was the judgment sharper than in her husband's gaze. Francesco de' Medici offered her no warmth, no courtesy beyond what ceremony demanded. He looked at her with a thinly veiled disdain, as though her asymmetry offended him personally. When they stood side by side, she felt his stiffness increase, rigid, as if her presence alone disrupted his image of perfection. And still she tried to meet the expectations placed upon her. She wore gowns that masked the uneven line of her hips, practiced controlled steps to hide the tilt in her walk, and lifted her chin to counterbalance the subtle curvature of her spine. Yet no effort softened Francesco's contempt. Isolation settled over her like a second skin. Surrounded by beauty, power, and celebration, Joanna realized she stood utterly alone in a palace that would never accept her, in a marriage that had rejected her from the first glance. Life inside the Medici palaces should have offered Joanna a refuge of elegance, yet instead it revealed itself as a labyrinth of whispers, judgment, and deliberate isolation. The halls of Florence glowed with frescoes and burnished gold, but none of their warmth reached her. Every room she entered, every corridor she crossed, she felt eyes move toward the slight curvature of her spine, the gentle slope of her left shoulder, the uneven rhythm created by the subtle tilt of her pelvis. These details, which she had learned to live with quietly in the monastery, became glaring imperfections under the scrutiny of Tuscan nobility. The court was a theater, and she, unwillingly, had become its most dissected character. Francesco's disdain set the tone for everyone else. His glances carried a cold, sharp edge that made even silence feel like humiliation. Servants bowed, but their gazes flickered toward her asymmetry. Ladies-in-waiting offered courtesy, but behind fans and lowered lashes, she sensed their pity and the small, poisonous satisfaction of being more physically perfect than their duchess. Even the grand architecture seemed to emphasize her vulnerability. The vast staircases strained her hips. The high halls amplified the uneven tap of her steps. The polished floors reflected the slight imbalance she tried so hard to conceal. And yet, Joanna carried herself with a quiet dignity that defied the cruel assessments around her. She learned to move in ways that softened the line of her shoulders, to arrange her gowns so that the tilt of her waist became a hidden curve rather than a flaw. She found solace in solitude, reading near shuttered windows, walking the palace gardens at dawn, whispering prayers in the dim light of private chapels. She never complained, never showed pain, never allowed anyone to see how deeply the walls of Florence pressed inward. But every day, beneath the weight of judgment and polished stone, she felt her world narrowing, tightening, preparing her for the tragedies that waited in the shadows. Bianca Capello entered Joanna's life not as a whisper, but as a storm, beautiful, calculating, and dangerously skilled in every art of seduction and survival that the Florentine court rewarded. Where Joanna approached the world with quiet endurance, Bianca strode through it with unshakable confidence, her beauty so radiant it practically demanded attention. Courtiers soon began calling her, half-jokingly, the Venetian enchantress, a woman whose smile could move men more effectively than diplomacy. And Francesco de' Medici fell under her spell long before he bothered to hide it. Bianca lived in Florence, still married to her first husband, Pietro Bonaventuri, a clerk whose sudden, accidental death in the streets raised more questions than the authorities cared to investigate. People whispered that Francesco had ensured the man's removal, or that Bianca herself had woven the plot, anything to clear the path. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Bianca was free. And now she entered the Medici court as if the palaces had always belonged to her. Francesco's cruelty became bolder. He housed Bianca in a lavish set of rooms only steps from Joanna's own, a boldness that shocked ambassadors and humiliated the Grand Duchess beyond words. Joanna, with her slight scoliosis pulling one shoulder lower and her uneven gait making every formal procession feel like an examination, suddenly found herself compared to a woman sculpted to dazzle. Bianca flaunted her youth, her beauty, her influence, appearing beside Francesco at events where Joanna stood alone. When Bianca announced her pregnancy by the Grand Duke, Joanna's world fractured. She, whose every childbirth had been a battle of pain against a body already burdened by deformity, watched her suffering dismissed as worthless next to a mistress's triumph. And in that moment, her marriage was no longer merely cold. It became a war she was never allowed to win. By the time Bianca Capello claimed her place beside Francesco, Joanna's world had already begun collapsing inward, and her body, strained by years of pregnancies, grief, and silent humiliation, was failing faster than anyone dared admit. The scoliosis that had once been a quiet childhood deformity now carved pain into every movement she made, pulling her left shoulder visibly lower and twisting her spine in ways that made even breathing feel like labor. Her pelvis, long misaligned, left her steps unsteady, and the courtiers who once whispered merely about her appearance now whispered about her fragility, her exhaustion, her ghostly thinness. Florence became a hostile landscape for Joanna, every staircase a threat, every corridor a test, every ceremonial event a torment she endured alone, while Bianca flourished in the glow of Francesco's attention. The Grand Duchess lived in a palace built to break someone like her, its endless marble floors, its vast rooms, and especially its steep stone staircases that echoed under her uneven steps. Yet she forced herself to maintain dignity, even as her body betrayed her. At night she lay awake, her spine throbbing, her hips burning from the imbalance. But she told no one. Even the servants assigned to her noticed how she leaned against walls for balance when she thought no one was watching, how she pressed her hand to the curve of her twisted back during long ceremonies. And still, Francesco showed no concern. If anything, her suffering seemed to harden his contempt. Rumors spread that he mocked her frailty behind closed doors, comparing her to Bianca's radiant strength. By early spring of the year 1578, Florence could sense that something terrible was drawing near. Joanna was pregnant again, her 8th child, her body pushed to a breaking point. And in the shadows of the palace, fate waited at the bottom of a staircase, preparing to strike with merciless precision. On the morning of April 10th of the year 1578, the palace awoke to a silence so heavy it felt like an omen. Joanna, heavily pregnant with her 8th child, moved down the stone staircase of the Palazzo Vecchio, her steps slow, uneven, shaped by the same scoliosis and tilted pelvis that had haunted her since childhood. She gripped the railing, her left shoulder lower than the right, her balance fragile, her body exhausted beyond measure. And then it happened. A slip. A gasp. The terrible echo of a fall that rippled through the palace like a thunderclap. Servants rushed to her, finding her crumpled at the foot of the stairs, her twisted spine now contorted further by the impact, her breath shallow, her hands trembling over the child inside her. The bleeding began immediately. Hours of agony followed. The infant died before birth. Joanna lingered in torment until the next day, when her suffering finally ended at the age of 31. The official explanation, an accident, spread quickly across Florence, but no one truly believed it. The Grand Duchess, fragile and despised by her husband, had fallen on the only staircase in the palace without carpets. Why had she been walking alone? Why had no attendants been assigned to her in her condition? And why, mere weeks after her death, did Francesco secretly marry Bianca Capello? The rumors grew darker. Whispers that Bianca had orchestrated the fall, that Francesco had pushed her, that poison had been used to ensure her silence. Her physical weakness, once merely a burden, became the perfect alibi for foul play. Florence buzzed with fear, suspicion, and rage. Some claimed they heard a scream before the fall, others that they saw shadows moving behind her. But the truth died with Joanna, buried beneath stone steps and courtly lies. leaving behind only questions and a trail of ghosts. Joanna's death should have marked the quiet end of a sad chapter, yet instead, it ignited a fire that spread through Florence and refused to die. Her fall down the staircase of the Palazzo Vecchio became the epicenter of a storm of suspicion, and although Francesco de' Medici tried to silence the court with a hasty burial and an even hastier remarriage to Bianca Capello, the city kept whispering. A duchess so frail, so exhausted, so visibly marked by scoliosis and a tilted pelvis that made every step hazardous. How could she have walked that staircase alone? Why was there no attendant? Why did the Grand Duke marry his mistress mere months later, in secret, as though fearing the judgment of the world? Fate, however, would not let the story end with Joanna's burial. In the year 1582, her only surviving son, young Prince Filippo, died suddenly at the age of 4. Some said illness, others said poison. The Medici line trembled. Then came the final blow. In the year 1587, Francesco and Bianca died within 1 day of each other, violently ill, their bodies ravaged by symptoms too similar to ignore. The official cause was malaria, but no one in Florence believed it. Rumors accused Francesco's brother, Ferdinando, a man with both motive and ambition. Others whispered that Joanna herself had cursed them, that the palace had taken its revenge. Whether by human hand or poetic justice, the two people who had tormented her were gone, leaving behind chaos and a dynasty scarred by scandal. And so, Joanna's story did not end with her death. It continued in every unanswered question, every suspicious burial, every shadow that moved through the Medici palaces. She became the ghost Florence never stopped hearing, soft, tragic, and forever falling down a staircase no one dared climb alone.